Next week, we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to meet with parents and students. And I know some of you have younger kids. We are planning on meeting, I think, with the kids from the student ministry, which will be the teenagers. I encourage you to come even if you have younger kids. We're going to divide into some groups. We're going to talk about communication, conflict containment within family relationships. And I'm hoping that you can hear from the teenagers and get a perspective from them, and I'm hoping they will hear from the adults and parents and get a perspective as well. And so we're going to, like I said, talk about communication, conflict containment, and have some interaction, some small group work with that I think will be healthy for everybody. So we need adults here to be with the kids. We're not going to just have adults in one section and kids in another. I'd like to try to get some interaction going. We're asking the students tonight to develop some questions that I'm going to get ahead of time. And I would ask you to put your questions on here and give to the staff, and they will get them to me as well. Jared has some cards if you don't have one. And we will try to address all these questions next week, and it will be helpful to know ahead of time. All right. Quick review. We've talked about parenting with grace and truth, and this comes from John 1:14, and this is a description of Christ. He was filled with grace and truth. And what we've talked about is parenting. One of the hardest parts of parenting is balancing grace and truth, relationship, teaching responsibility. If you have too much relationship and no rules, you're going to get rebellion. If you have too many rules and no relationship, you're going to get rebellion. And to me, the hardest part of parenting is finding that balance. There are times where you need to work on the relationship with your child. And there are times where you need to hold them accountable, give them consequences, and be a disciplinarian. The idea of discipline is to teach. That's what disciple means. So what is the most effective way of teaching? Yelling and screaming is not the most effective way. We have a lot of research that shows that does not work very well in the short run or in the long run. It may work in the short run in the sense for 30 minutes you may get compliance, but the child basically learns, I don't have to do anything till mom or dad yells. So what happens is parent ends up yelling more, kid learns, I don't have to do it till mom or dad yells. They don't really mean it till then. That's a bad dynamic to develop. You want to parent like a good boss. We talked about, think about characteristics of a good boss or a good teacher that motivated you. And are you the teacher that you remember that you admired, you respected, you wanted to work for? Are you the teacher that you hated, you didn't want to do anything for, you just wanted to get out of their class, you wanted to give them a hard time if you could? Which way do you parent? Think of it in terms of that. Talked about managing your emotions through healthy thinking. As a parent, if you care about your child, I promise you, you're going to get frustrated. The only way you can not get frustrated as a parent is not to care. And so managing those frustrations becomes really important. If you lose control, you're going to lose control of the situation. And then finally, solve the problem rather than reacting emotion. You got to figure out what the problem is, what's the most effective way to solve the problem, rather than venting, ranting, raving, just reacting emotionally. I had the opportunity earlier this year to speak to 500 students at a church gathering. And I was on a panel, and so one of the questions I was asked was, what do you wish you had known as a teenager? And so it got me to thinking a lot about that question. And tonight I'm going to give you some ideas of things that I have learned with 40 years of practice as a psychologist and 40 years as a student and teacher of the Bible. And sort of where this intersects, and I think some of the keys to good mental health. First of all, we are all sinners. Now, this sounds harsh, negative, and critical, but I see it as very refreshing. Because what it means is we're all equal. No one is better or worse than you are. The other thing it means is it helps you develop realistic expectations. You put a family together, and if you expect everybody to be perfect, what's going to happen? You're going to be real disappointed. But if you go into it with the idea, hey, I'm not perfect, my child's not perfect, sometimes things are going to go wrong. I better know how to manage that. It's a whole different perspective. You know, you see TV shows and perfect family, and they never yell at each other, and they never disagree, and so forth. Folks, that's not real. That is not family life. And if you start with the idea we're all sinners, then you don't have to be perfect. You know you're not. You know your kid's not. And I find it a very refreshing idea. The other thing it does is it eliminates the need to compare. Anytime you compare, you're going to decide you're better than the other person or you're worse than the other person. And neither one of those healthy positions to be in. They have problems, I have problems. They have strengths, I have strengths. I'm in the process of doing a blog on this concept right now, and I hope to get it online within the next week. And my major professor in college, in graduate school, introduced me to a concept that I think was very helpful in me being a good counselor. It really helped me become a better counselor. And the idea was best effort. Everybody is putting forth their best effort. If I had your DNA and your life experiences, your learning, what's the probability that my responses would be very similar to yours? Very high. We all are born with a DNA. We all have life experiences, some good, some not so good. We learn from those experiences, which becomes part of our habits, our behavior patterns, and our reactions. And so if I can think of the person I'm interacting with is doing the best they can, that mindset helps me to engage in a constructive way rather than a critical, judgmental way that triggers defensiveness. And we've talked about when you trigger defensiveness, you're going to trigger fight or flight. Person is either going to get aggressive with you verbally or physically, or they're going to shut down and withdraw. With your child, if they go into fight or flight mode, you got to figure out a way of waiting and dealing with the thing, whatever the issue is, when they're out of fight or flight. So this idea of we're all sinners is not a critical negative, it's a reality. And spiritually, it's the beginning of the gospel. Well, the character of God is the beginning of the gospel, but our character is the next step in that. And if you think you're perfect and not a sinner, then you don't need a Savior. I have never shopped for a parachute. Why? I have no intentions of jumping out of an airplane. And if you don't think you're a sinner, you have no need for a Savior. So acceptance of that just makes us all equal. It's not a negative, critical thing. The next idea is be careful trying to get the approval of others. Galatians 1:10, for am I now trying to persuade people or God? Or am I striving to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Jesus Christ. This is one of the most important things you do for your child. Peer pressure is a real deal. If I did a lot of work with the Department of Juvenile Justice and did evaluations on kids trying to predict which ones we thought would get in more trouble, which ones wouldn't. And if I could only ask them one question, that one question would be, tell me about your friends. Peer relationships is the best predictor of who's going to get in trouble and who's not. It's consistent across the juvenile justice literature. So you want to know about your kids' friends. You want them to be independent. It's normal for teens to want peer approval. That's part of the flaws we have that's normal. There's a normal pathology is what I call it. It's not healthy for us, but it's normal. And so helping your child to become independent, to think for themselves is really important. And even as a parent, you want to do the same thing. If you are worried about how you compare to other parents or whether other parents are going to agree with you, you can get yourself in trouble with that as well. Acceptance of reality. Probably about 4 or 5 years ago, it dawned on me that most of my day was spent helping people accept reality in terms of the practice of psychology. Now, I'm not sure why it took me so long to figure that out, but it just dawned on me that acceptance of reality is one of the keys of good mental health. For example, what is the reality? Are things always going to go the way you want them to? If you don't accept that reality, then what happens each time it doesn't go your way? You get angry, you get frustrated, you may get anxious. Everybody should like me. I'm a nice guy. Not everybody likes me. Can you believe that? If you're trying to get everybody to like you, you're doing something that Jesus Christ himself couldn't do. He was perfect. What'd they do to him? They killed him. Not everybody is going to like you. That doesn't mean something is wrong with you. And this is a message you want to get to your kids that's so important. And what you model, we're going to talk about modeling later on, but that's really important. If you're worried about what your peers think of you, then what are you modeling for your child? One of the ways to know if you're dealing with reality is the word should. If you use the word should a lot, then you have created what you think should be reality. People should be nice. No, they shouldn't because they're not. My child should behave all the time. No, your child should not because they don't. If they should, they would. They don't, so they shouldn't. It's just, if you don't deal with reality, you create this fantasy world and you don't really cope with it, you don't problem solve, you just talk about how things should be and it results in emotional elevation, venting, so forth and so on, that really doesn't accomplish a whole lot. Process versus outcome. This comes from sports psychology, test anxiety, to focus on the process rather than the outcome. Let me give you an example. Social anxiety. A lot of teens, of course, worry about what their friends are thinking, and social anxiety, and a lot of adults do too. So which is more important? To be nice to people or try to get people to like you? If you go into a situation and you just simply, I'm going to be nice to people, which one do you have control of? Being nice or getting people to like you? Again, we go back to Jesus. He was perfect. What happened? They killed him. So even if you are perfect and you're nice to everybody, some people aren't going to like you. And so engaging in the process, test anxiety. If you worry about the outcome, you increase the anxiety. Increase anxiety, performance has a U-curve. There's a diminishing return with anxiety in terms of performance. And so if I prepare, I study, and engage in the process, then the outcome will probably come. Same thing with parenting, coming up with strategies. Sometimes you want to target processes, not outcomes. For example, grades. Grades are a horrible thing to target. First of all, you're not going to know till 9 weeks. So that's way too long to develop a reinforcement program for. But you target processes, study habits, organizational skills, those kinds of things, and that's what you reinforce. You try to develop the habits rather than targeting the outcome. So process versus outcomes is an important concept. Most bad things are temporary. I'm sorry, yes. Wait a minute, we need to get the... Yeah, anytime.
Okay, so you had just mentioned, process versus outcomes. But when do you use the outcomes to determine the processes you need to focus on? So, if their grades aren't good, there has to be some focus on the outcome to even know if the processes that you've got in place are even working. So, you've got them doing things, you've got them studying maybe, and the outcome still isn't where you need it to
So
be.
how would you increase grades?
Other than studying?
That's a
And
process.
and tutoring, right, but if
So
you're
you
doing
target the
that-
process, and once you target the process, if you get the process right, the outcome generally will take care of itself. Now, is the outcome sort of the indication of a problem? Yes, but in terms of intervention, I think you have to be very careful targeting because it doesn't tell you anything. How am I going to increase my child's grades?
So I guess what the point you're making is, as a parent, we can look at the outcomes, look at the behaviors, look at whatever it is, but that's not what we focus on with the child. What we focus on with the child is how do we implement processes, and we probably need to try different things to see what works to change the outcome over time. But use that very gingerly as we're speaking to the child to not focus on that outcome. But they still need to know what they're shooting for, for goals or what have you.
I would say you use the outcomes, excuse me, you use the outcome to identify the problems. And then to improve the problem, you target the processes that's going to help with that.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Most bad things are temporary. This is from the optimism, pessimism literature. When bad things happen, pessimists see it as permanent, pervasive, and personal. Going to be this way forever. It's affecting my whole life, and I'm the only one this happens to, or it's my fault. Whereas the optimist sees it as temporary, specific to that event, and it may happen to everyone. It may not totally be my fault. So, for example, you make an F on a test. The pessimist will say things like, I'm stupid, I can't do anything right. They globalize it. What does that do to perseverance, mood, kind of sticking with things, continuing to make effort? It decreases it. So the optimist sees it as temporary. If you think about most issues in your life, they're going to be temporary. Your child is going to go through a lot of different phases. Young kids. My son at one point wanted to be, his future career was going to be on the garbage truck. And in the beginning, he wanted to be the guy who rode on the back and actually emptied the garbage cans. Later, he promoted himself and wanted to drive. If you react to everything your child says, be careful, because so much of it is temporary, and if you react to so many things in a negative way or critical way or questioning way, the child will become defensive, may shut down on you. So understand that a lot of things are temporary. You want to figure out solutions. Kids will go through times where they may not study. My son was ADHD, and he brought home some bad reports, and this was elementary school. And so it's like, what are you doing? Well, Dad, I've been working so hard for a couple of weeks, I just decided to take a break. In elementary school? Yeah, and he is now, has a master's degree, student, pastor, been to seminary, and so forth and so on. You're going to go through bumps and valleys, and if you think it's permanent, what we do as a parent, we talked about anxiety last week, but so your child brings home a bad grade. If you see it as permanent, oh, he's so irresponsible. He's never going to amount to anything. He's going to end up living under the interstate. So you've gone from one bad grade to a homeless adult. Yeah. It's one bad grade. We got to figure out how to solve it. It's temporary. So it's just more of an optimistic attitude, and there's a lot of research on the benefits of being optimistic versus pessimistic. Next, to be comfortable, you must learn to be uncomfortable. I was reading something this week by Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, and he said that learning to manage anxiety the right way will avoid a lot of difficulties. Anxiety is normal. You're going to have anxiety. You do something new, you do something different, you do something that is unpredictable, you do something that is challenging, you do something that you're evaluated on. It is normal to be anxious. And if your goal is to eliminate the anxiety, then you engage in ritualistic behavior, avoidant behavior to get rid of the anxiety. What do you learn in the process? First of all, it will work temporarily, but then you learn to avoid more. And you avoid more, and you avoid more. And so you want your child to embrace anxiety, understand it's normal, but not allow the anxiety to dictate what they do. And as a parent, if you try to keep everything comfortable between you and your child, or you and your teenager especially, what are you going to do? You're going to compromise on some values that you need to teach them. Yeah. If you don't have some conflict with your teenager, you are probably not doing your job. The whole idea of being a parent and a teenager, what is a teenager supposed to be trying to do? Become independent. That's the developmental task of a teenager. That's normal, healthy developmental. In this process of becoming independent, they are going to disagree with you, even about stupid stuff. And so it is okay to have conflict and figure out how to resolve conflict. Sometimes with teenagers, you go into bobblehead method. What they're saying is so ridiculous, you don't need to teach, you don't need to correct. And so sometimes you're going to have to make some tough decisions and say no. One of ours was, there was a lot of research that kids had a lot of accidents. The first 90 days they had their license if they had someone in the car. And so our rule was, first 90 days you had no one in the car. And that was not a popular decision, got a lot of pushback and so forth, but it was the right decision. And so sometimes you've got to make decisions that your teen is not going to like. So you've got to be uncomfortable with that. We don't like to be unpopular with our kids. It comes with a responsibility. All right. So any questions on these ideas, these themes that we've talked about?
I realize it'd be different for every family, but if you could tell your younger self, or look back and give your younger self advice, what specific behaviors would you focus on the most, or what would you focus most of your time on trying to model, or which behaviors would you focus most of your
My kids?
Yes.
Yeah. The first thing is to make sure that the relationship is such that I have credibility. If you don't have a good relationship, then when you have to make these tough decisions, it's much harder. You know, kids deep down inside want security. They want predictability. Predictability creates security. It's like a fence. You know, a fence keeps you from going out, and we don't like that. We want to be free. But it also keeps bad things from coming in, and we like that security and that protection. And if you take away the fences, then people move to the center and seek support and comfort. So I think the relationship is first of all. In young kids, and this is kind of my theory, and I don't have data to fully back this up, but my experience is, let's say up to 12, and each kid is different, but you teach them to accept authority. If I say, go stand on the corner, I want you to go stand on the corner. If you have a teacher who says, go get in the corner and stand on your head, I want you to do your very best to go get in the corner and stand on your head. If you think it is unreasonable, you come to me and I will have an adult-to-adult conversation with that teacher. And I will advocate for you. But learning compliance early on is really important with whoever it may be. And then as you reach those later years, it's more about problem solving, negotiation, compromise, communication, self-expression in appropriate ways. But a lot of it's a maturity factor. That brain is not ready to take on those responsibilities until, they get into the teenage years. And the frontal cortex of the brain, which is associated with problem solving, communication, delay of gratification, cognitive flexibility, all those things, does not fully develop till you're 25 to 30 years old. So understanding a child's brain, that there's a parenting movement out there of never say no. So you've got a person who is brain impaired that you're going to let them make all the decisions. It doesn't make sense to me. And it's real popular, and it's popular in a lot of churches. And the idea is you're teaching your child to be independent, but you're taking a sinner with an immature brain who was born with an evil heart. This is Scripture. This isn't me. This is Scripture saying all this. And you're going to let them make decisions about their life. So you set the boundaries early on. They learn to respect authority. Then you teach them as they grow into the teenage years, where the brain is starting to develop and more mature, and they're working toward independence as a normal developmental task. That's when you teach self-expression, standing up for yourself, assertiveness skills, those kinds of things. So to me, that's kind of what I would do. All right, so behavior management. The important thing here is model desired behavior. The idea of do what I say, not what I do, does not work well, especially with teenagers. Teenagers hate hypocrites as much as anything. They want authentic, real, even if you disagree with them. I mean, I've had conversations with teenagers, just very blunt conversations, but I had a relationship with them that I could say things and they would laugh at it or whatever. So you've got to have that relationship, but you've got to be authentic. You can't try to be their friend and talk their language and be like them if that's not who you are. You got to be yourself, and they will appreciate and respect that more, and that's part of building that relationship. Also, it is very powerful. We call it vicarious learning. You learn by observing others. And so it's very much in the learning literature and data-driven that, kids learn what they see. Now, they have to respect the model that they're watching in order for it to have more impact. There's two approaches to parenting that I see. One is you train your child with certain targets in mind. You have an idea of what kind of person you want to see them become, and you're training them to become that person. It's like training a dolphin to jump through a hoop, training a lion to jump through a ring of fire. Is a dolphin going to naturally jump through a hoop? No. Is a lion going to jump through a ring of fire? No. Is a teenager going to do everything you ask them to do? No. Or a child, let's even go back younger. Are they going to do everything you ask them to do? No. And so you're training, as opposed to the other approach is, you wait and see what behavior you get, then you either reward or you punish. And it's reactive rather than proactive. And I encourage a more proactive approach. These are the values, these are the goals, these are the things that, I would love to see in my child. And then you model those, you train those, you use reinforcement, positive and negative reinforcement. It's just how you approach parenting, I think, is really important. Sometimes we just sit back and we wait to see what we get and then react. And you have to be careful with that. The next one is act, don't yak. This is taken from Russell Barkley. And Russell Barkley has probably done as much research on ADHD and oppositional kids as any psychologist around. One of the mistakes that I see parents make within the last 15, 20 years is they talk too much. They want to beg their child to want to do what the parent wants them to do, and they want to talk them into it. So verbal persuasion is one of the most common forms of parenting. Unfortunately, it's one of the least effective. I'm not saying don't talk to your child, but when there is discipline, it is really important to use that time not to try to verbally persuade. So with oppositional kids, what we have seen in the research is that parents will request behavior change 3 to 6 times. Then they will threaten 3 to 6 times. So you have 6 to 12 interactions. So suppose your child is watching TV and you say, please go pick up your clothes. And you do this 3 to 6 times you request. Then you threaten, if you don't go pick up your clothes, you're never going to watch TV again 3 to 6 times. So you got 6 to 12 interactions. Then what do? You yell. And what is the child doing the whole time that you're requesting warning 6 to 12 times? They're continuing to watch TV. So what behavior is being reinforced in the child? They're getting what they want. And remember, this brain development in child, give me what I want right now, kill me 10 minutes from now. The future is irrelevant. It's right this moment. ADHD kids live in the moment. That's one of their biggest problems is they don't anticipate future consequences, and they don't learn from past mistakes because they're so in the moment. Well, younger kids are in the moment. And so it's really important. So the model that I recommend is you request behavior change. You wait 3 to 5 seconds, and you don't count out loud. You just wait. If they have not initiated the behavior change in 3 to 5 seconds, and you said, if you don't go do this right now, this is what's going to happen. You tell them the consequence. You wait 3 to 5 seconds, and if they have not initiated it within 3 to 5 seconds, you give them the consequence. Now, when you do the 6 to 12 steps, what happens to your frustration with each step? It goes up each time. Whereas this way, you're talking 3 steps, 3 to 5 seconds, 15 seconds at the most. And it's dealt with. Immediacy of consequences is really important in terms of learning theory. And the parenting approach I use is based on learning theory. How do we learn? How do kids learn? How do animals learn? And a lot of it's reinforcement theory. If behavior X is followed by a positive event, there's increased probability that behavior X will increase. If behavior X is followed by a negative event, high probability the behavior will decrease. And so reinforcement theory is really important. But this idea of act, don't yak, and I think this is especially true with younger kids. This does not mean you don't talk to them. You have lots of conversations with them. When you're, watching TV shows or watching movies, what they're learning from that, that's when you have a lot of these conversations. But when there is a rule violation, you want to deal with it very succinctly, very concisely, and move on. And you are less likely to get frustrated, and your child is less likely to get frustrated when you do that.
Got a question?
Yes?
Act, don't yak. Obviously, when possibility of that. And so my question would be, I guess I'd probably use it to try and convince them of a decision or a behavior that I feel is in their better interests versus what they are wanting to do, maybe in the short term versus long term, without basically trying to sell him or her on that. If they're still choosing the option that you don't feel is the correct option, especially later in teenage years when some of these decisions are kind of important and can affect
Right.
domino things down the road, what do you morph to in that direction? Like if you just do not think that is the correct option and you've said 1,000 words already trying to convince them.
Yeah. This request, warrant, consequence, I think is important with younger kids. And I think if you use it in younger years, you decrease some of the problems you have in the teenage years because of the idea of respect for authority. And then you get into, communication. You certainly have these conversations. One of the things to keep in mind, you are the parent. How much do you know in their eyes? You're stupid as a day is long. I am an expert in ADHD. I have done workshops out the gazoo, worked with ADHD students every day, patients every day, parents, done workshops, taught workshops on it. I didn't know anything in the eyes of my son. And so you have to kind of understand that, and that's part of the verbal persuasion limitation is they don't think you really know what you're talking about. And so that's the reason that sometimes consequences is really important. One of the things that I wish I'd added to the list of things I've learned is make sure you stay focused on what you have control of. And as a parent, this is really important. Can I force a child to do anything? When they're 4 or 5 or 6, yes, probably so. I can pick them up and do that. But as a teenager, can I force them to do anything? I don't recommend engaging physically with your children to try to stop things. So you talk about choices. If you choose to do this, this is what's going to happen. Is that what you really want to see happen? And you even play it out. One of the things when kids are frustrated, they're in that limbic part of the brain. And that's just raw emotion, very irrational. And you're trying to move the process to at least the prefrontal cortex, preferably the frontal cortex, where there's some potential for rationality. So what you do is you play the scenario out. So if you do this, what do you think is going to happen? And you try to ask questions to get them to think. And they're going to probably, if they're in that testy mode, probably going to give you some ridiculous answer. So let me give you kind of an example here. You request your teen to take out the garbage. And they say no. Not going to do it. So you say, so what do you think is going to happen if you don't take out the garbage? I don't know. I'm going to get mad. I'm going to yell. I'm going to scream. I'm going to ground you for 6 years. You're going to get upset. You're going to walk out the door. Is that what you want to see happen? Do you have any ideas of what you could do? And at this point, if they're, have some behavior problems, emotional difficulties, you kind of negotiate, and what you're trying to do is get to the point where their idea works. And so you say, what do you think we could do? Well, I'll do it in 15 minutes. Well, that's a great idea, but the concern I have is when you've told me in the past that you would do it in 15 minutes, you never get around to it. And then what happens? I get mad, I yell, I scream, I ground you for 6 years. Is that what we want? You're trying to problem solve and communicate with the teen. And then you say, is there any other ideas you have? You keep going to that idea. Do you have any ideas? Well, could you remind me in 15 minutes? That I can do. I'll give you 15 minutes. And again, you're kind of compromising, but, and this is not a life or death issue, not one of those important issues, and sometimes you can't do that. I mean, you have to be realistic. There are times where you may have to call the police or whatever it may be. I mean, you may have to make some very difficult decisions. There are no magic answers of saying the perfect thing in certain situations. It's unfortunately, it's just not there. So those are the kinds of processes that I try to get parents and teens to engage in, is more of problem solving rather than blaming, criticizing, yelling, so forth and so on. And again, I think if you start early on with getting compliant kids, you have a better shot of that working. Okay? All right. So some of the concepts of behavior management from learning theory that's really important. One is extinction. And the idea of extinction is you take away the reinforcer, whatever it may be. So let's say that every time a child doesn't get their way, they scream, and you come and you try to talk to them. What's the danger of that? They're getting your attention. Kids are like Hollywood stars. They'll do anything for attention. And you have to always be careful with that. That is this to get attention? So they get your attention. The screaming is screaming, crying, tantrums are increasing. Because they're getting attention. So you realize, so you stop paying attention to it. So you are cutting out the reinforcer. Now, what's going to happen? The behavior is going to get worse, then it will drastically drop off. So a lot of times parents will ignore, and because the behavior gets worse, they give up on the process. So you have to be persistent and understand the behavior will get worse, but if you will persevere and stick with it and be consistent, it will drop off. So this is the extinction. You're eliminating the reinforcer. Kids are going to try to get it back to the old system. They like the old system better. Shaping is a concept of you're starting here and you're trying to get to here. And so let's use grades as an example here. So this is 9 weeks. I'll give you $1 for every A you make, or whatever it may be. Probably will not work because it's too long. Remember, what's the brain? Short term. Doesn't have the ability for long-term decision making. So immediacy of consequences is really important. So if they bring their books home and study, 1 day, 2 days, and then you may extend it a little bit and expect them to spend more time studying. And then they have to study even when they don't have assignments. But you're working it out. You start with small steps. An example, I ran a residential program for emotionally disturbed adolescents years ago, and these were tough kids, a lot of trauma, broken families, substance abuse, truancy in school, failing school. And so we had a point system. They got points for different things and then could earn rewards. And so one of the things was schoolwork. And so when a kid came in, if they studied 5 minutes in the afternoon, then they got their point for homework, schoolwork. And then the next week we go to 10 minutes, and then the next week 20 minutes, and then eventually everybody was studying 30 minutes. If I had started with 30 minutes with these kids who have been truant, failing school, and so forth, it'd been too overwhelming. So you have to start. It's important to know where your child is to start. If you want to go to Chicago, what direction do you go? Depends on where you start. If you start from here, you go north. If you start in Canada, you go south. Same thing with your child. Know where they're at. And this is important to understand if your child is ADHD. You're at a different starting point than a non-ADHD child. If your child is anxious, if your child has learning disabilities, it's really important to understand and start where your child is at, and then build from there. Schedules of reinforcement. So, to change behavior, you want to reinforce every time the behavior occurs. So let's use brushing teeth, for example. So every time your child brushes their teeth, you want to reinforce them. You give them whatever it is that you think will encourage the behavior to continue. And you keep doing this. And when you have 85, 90% compliance rate, then you want to go into a maintenance phase. And this is where a lot of parenting programs break down, is they use continuous and then they just stop. And then the behavior goes back to zero. So with continuous schedule of reinforcement, it's an unpredictable schedule. So they may brush their teeth, you reinforce. They may brush their teeth, you don't reinforce. They may brush their teeth, you don't reinforce. They may brush their teeth, you reinforce. They may brush their teeth, you may reinforce. It's a variable, unpredictable schedule. Why will people stand at a slot machine for 6 to 8 hours? Variable schedule of reinforcement. The gaming people understand these concepts better than the education system understands these concepts. And so, if you pull the handle on a slot machine and you lose for 30 minutes, you're probably going to walk away. Or if you pull and you win for 30 minutes, you're going to stand there, and then all of a sudden you start losing, and when you start losing, you're going to walk away. But if you win every now and then, you'll stand there. And it's the same thing with the variable schedule of reinforcement. And what you're trying to do is you make it very unpredictable. And so it's an unpredictable but what's happening is you're spreading it out and natural consequences are beginning to take over so that eventually you can phase out the reinforcement and natural consequences will take over. The important part is to make sure that what you're using is reinforcing. And for each child, that may be different. My wife was a middle school art teacher, and she had this huge room with all these cabinets, so she decided that if you misbehave, you had to clean her cabinets Well, all of a sudden the kids who were behaving said, why can't we clean your cabinets? So she had to turn it in that if you behaved, you got to clean the cabinets. Not supposed to work. But you don't come up with ideas that you think should work. Again, that should. What's reality? It's what works. And for every kid, you got to find that secret. I was working with a 4-year-old who was probably ADHD, but a little too young to diagnose at that point, who was crawling out of his crib at night, getting into the kitchen and found playing with knives. So we had to kind of make a pretty drastic intervention pretty quickly. And so he, and the parents would say, well, we would take his toys and put them in the garbage, and it didn't faze him. And so I said, I want you to get toys for a 6 or 7-year-old. This kid was pretty mature, and so they got some new toys for a 6 or 7-year-old, and when they took it away, he began screaming, and I said, gotcha, sucker. You've got to know what's important to the child. Not what you would like, but what's going to motivate them. This is where using electronics as a reinforcer can be very beneficial. You know, using video games. If you can use it as a reinforcer to get the behavior you want, and it's not illegal, unethical, and so forth, then use it. You got to figure out what motivates your child, not what you want to motivate them. So this idea of picking the reinforcer is really important. And we've kind of talked about this all the way through. Immediacy and consistency of consequences is really important. If you are not consistent, you're going to increase the probability of noncompliance. If it's not immediate, if it's too long, it's just not going to have an impact. And especially with younger kids, remember brain development. I mean, you have to keep that perspective. So, a couple of practical ideas. One of my favorite techniques that I actually came up with this one is practice. If you are not good at something, how do you get better? You practice. Whether it's sports, art, music, whatever it may be. So if you are not good at closing a door and you tend to run through and slam the door, what do you need to do? Practice closing the door. So I want you to go in and out the door 10 times. And then the next time they slam the door, still need more practice. Let's do it 20 times this time. And you keep going until they finally figure out, I'm going to keep practicing until I get it right. Getting homework back to school. So I want you to sit at your desk, finish your homework, pick it up, go put it in your backpack. Take it out, go back, sit at your desk, pick it up, go put it in your backpack. You need practice getting it into your backpack, or whatever it may be. But kids accept this as practice. It's really a punishment paradigm because you're infringing on their time. But you're not calling it punishment, you're calling it practice. And so, you know, if you're not doing it the right way, you need more practice. I don't want to practice. Then do it the right way. So that's one of the techniques that I found useful. One rule. What would happen if you had two teams playing a game and one team is playing basketball rules and one team is playing football rules? Chaos. Who wins the game? You don't know. What happens in families when there's two sets of rules? Chaos. And so the idea of one rule, and so you have a teen who's lying. So you say to them, okay, we're going to play by one rule, and you explain the idea of football, basketball, you explain that concept, and you say, we're going to play by one rule, and you get to pick the rule. Is it okay for people in the family to lie? Now, before you make this decision, I want to remind you, I could tell you that this Friday night you're going to be able to go out with your friends. But Friday afternoon, if we adopt this rule, I could say, nope, I was just lying. That's the rule. You pick it. But we're all going to play. What teens want is they want one set of rules where they do what they want, and you behave by a set of responsible rules. It's normal. I mean, it's just the way it is. And so having one rule, but it's important you play by the same rules. I had a young lady years ago, and I may have shared this. I can't remember if I shared this story or not, but was working with her, and she had gotten some friends, and she was house sitting, invited 3 or 4 friends over. Well, those 3 or 4 friends invited 3 or 4 of their friends, and their friends invited more friends, and pretty soon it was out of control. And I honestly believe she did not intend other than the 3 or 4 friends. Police ended up getting called, and so her parents got back in town. They were out of town at the moment, and they got back in town, and we were in a family session, and so they told her she was going to be grounded for 6 weeks. And she said, no, I'm not going to do it. And I'm like, what? This is a good kid. I mean, she is normally very compliant. She says, I know about the pot you have in the shoebox in the closet, and you're going to ground me for this? I don't think so. And I said, I agree with you. You can't be a hypocrite. Whatever values you're expecting your child to adopt and live by are the values that it's important they see you adopting and living by. That may not seem fair, may not seem right, may go against everything you believe, but I would encourage you to accept the reality that that's the way it is. Treasure chest, grab bag, this tends to be for younger kids, and so you target the behavior you're trying to change, and then you get a little box or a bag, and you take 20 slips of paper or whatever, and you write things on there that are reinforcers. And you can go to Dollar Tree and get material things. I mean, you can do it pretty cheaply. Let the kid go with you and pick out things. And again, you know, I like the mentality of slot machines, so you put one big prize in there that's a little bigger than the rest. You can use social reinforcers, playing a game with mom or dad, getting to pick the family dessert, or whatever it may be. Material things, food items that they like, whatever it may be. And then each time that they engage in the behavior that you're requesting, then you let them go to the grab bag. And you make a big deal out of it. There's a social reinforcer to it. I really appreciate you doing this. You've done such a great job. Here's your prize. And they get to pick it out. And for kids, that can be very, very powerful. And again, you eventually want to go to the intermittent schedule. You use it to get behavior change, and then you don't do it as often. And you tell the child, okay, so you're doing really good. We're probably not going to do it as often, but you're still going to have the opportunity to go to the grab bag at times. And then so the social atmosphere of it is an important part of it. So those are just some practical techniques that I found, along with request, warn, consequence, especially for younger kids. Teenagers, more problem-solving, communication, those kinds of things. Most important parental task you can engage in is encourage your child's relationship with Jesus Christ. and you need to model this, you need to use examples from the Bible for illustrations. There's a parable of the workers who come to the field. You know, you get, this isn't fair. You get that a lot. And so you use the parable of the guy who hired workers. And so one guy worked all day, and he was promised denarii or whatever they had at the time. And then another guy comes later in the morning at 10 o'clock, and so he's promised a denarii. And then one comes at noon, and so on. And so at the end of the day, everybody gets paid the same thing. And you ask, was that fair? You ask the team, you have a conversation, was that fair? What was promised? Did the employer stick to his promise? Did he do what he said he would do? Yes. Now, if you don't like it, you can renegotiate the next day and say, hey, can I come at noon rather than 8 o'clock and still get the same price? You can renegotiate. But this is the rule right now. And so using illustrations like that from Scripture, using that as a basis for certain decisions that you make, getting them to think about what's really important in their life. And, you know, be empathetic. Understand the pressure on them, the distractions that they're dealing with. But at the same time, all these pressures and so forth are going to be dealt with when they have a value system that they can turn to, that they know what it's based on. It's not based on their emotions. The highest danger is basing your value system on your emotions. You know, culture today tells you to do what you feel like doing. If I had done what I felt like doing, I wouldn't be standing here tonight, I promise you. And I doubt any of you would be either. Yeah. So make this a priority. Be intentional about it. The summary, trying to give you kind of just an overall summary, is empathy for emotions, accountability for behavior. Understand kids don't want to do things. Understand they may not want to study. They don't want to take out the garbage. Understand they want to spend time with their friends more than you. Understand they may want to spend time in their rooms more in the teenage years than they used to. It's normal developmental. Every teenager will develop an allergy to their parents at some point in the teenage years. Don't take it personally. They will come back around and you can have very healthy relationships. They have got to prove their independence. Who do they have to prove their independence the most from? Parents. Because those are the two people they've been most dependent on their entire lives. So that's who they got to prove their independence from. Like I said, I was stupid as all get out when my son was growing up. And he's a student pastor, and recently he quoted me when he was doing some teaching. So it will come back around. It's temporary. But this is what they're supposed to do. Thoughts, questions, comments?
I wish we were here for the other 2 weeks, but this is our first time coming. How do I get my teenager, like you said, them to come next week? Like, how do I get them here? Like, how do I get them here?
Yeah, that's a tough one. You try to motivate them and say, look, I will do certain things for you, but I need you to do certain things for me. And if I do this for you, then I want you to participate in church. Now, depending on kind of where they're at, early on in our family, it was just a standard, you're going to church. And that was it. But that was started, and now if you try to impose that rule with later teenagers, then you can get a rebellion that becomes anti-church and so forth, and you have to be careful with that as well. So it's each child, but trying to find out something that would motivate them. And with the idea of also watch how you frame their expectations. if you paint it as everybody's going to like you, everybody's going to welcome you, that may not happen in a youth group. And so, but you frame it as, if you keep going long enough, you will find somebody that you can connect with. You know how to talk to people, you know how to be nice to people. If you go with the idea of just being nice to people, eventually you will find somebody. It may take a while. Be careful lying to your kids and making them think this Pollyannish view of everything's going to be wonderful. That's not life. I get so frustrated because kids will complain about somebody being mean to them, and the advice from teachers or whatever is, well, if you'll just be nice to them, they'll be nice back. That's a lie. Some people are just mean. So you be realistic, paint a realistic picture, but you try to negotiate something that motivates them. Now, if they're younger, you can just say, this is a rule, and this is what we're going to do as a family. This is our value system and what's important to us.
I teach, and a couple times a week, my middle school son rides his bus to my school. And this week, he said to me, "You are so nice and patient with your students, and you are not with us." And I don't really know what to do with that. I didn't know what to say in the moment, and I still don't know what to say.
So you would say, what you want to do is try to get away from labels and try to not use labels yourself, but describe behavior. One of the things we're going to talk about next week, conflict containment, is be careful analyzing intent, using labels. You want to describe behavior. So you would say, can you give me an example of what it is that I do that is that you think is different? And to acknowledge it, you're probably right. I probably do. And part of the reason I do is because I care more about you than I do these other kids. I mean, if you want to see this in action, go to a Little League ballpark. You will be able to pick out the coach and the coach's child, because they'll either let them do anything they want to, or they're harder on them than any other kid. Why? Because they care more about them. And when you care more, it's more intense, the feelings that you have, and your anxiety is higher as a parent. And so you explain all that and say, yeah, I probably do. And I care about you, but I want you to let me know what it is that I do. Also be careful, children are master manipulators. They are outstanding at emotional blackmail. They will try to make you feel guilty so they can get what they want. Be careful with that. Empathy for the emotion. You don't let us do this. You don't let us have candy, whatever. You're right, I don't, and I'm not going to. I understand you would like candy, but I'm not going to let you do that. So it's hard.
I didn't really say anything. I said, let me think about that for
Yeah.
a while.
Yeah, kids will manipulate you, and you always have to kind of look for the agenda. It can start out as a legitimate concern that they have, but then all of a sudden they're getting something out of it, a later bedtime, so all of a sudden they got to talk about this issue every night. And it started out as a legitimate issue, but now they've learned, and it's not always a cognitive awareness, it's just we learn things. If I do this, this happens, and I'm not even aware of it sometimes. And so you have to always assess that too, of what their agenda is as best you can.
With kids with ADHD, I know I think it was the first session, you said how sometimes the long-term outcomes aren't as good for individuals like that. Other than looking into medication and then all the things we've covered so far, is there anything additional you think that parents should consider for kids like that?
Yeah, I think I may have responded to some at some point, but it's prayer and perseverance is important. But Consistency of consequences. And because of the executive function, learning memory, those kinds of things, it doesn't always apply. But I think at some point, as that brain matures, it kicks in. And so I think just trying to be consistent with it, being patient, not beating yourself up, understand their frustrations, having some empathy. I mean, I could see it on my son's face when he had forgotten an assignment. And it wasn't he was trying to manipulate me. He had genuinely forgotten the assignment. But just trying to be consistent with behavioral consequences. Even if it's forgetting, there still has to be some degree of consequences. You try to use more positive with kids with any type of disability, ADHD, anxiety. You try to use positive when you can. So that with an ADHD kid, you could stay on them 24/7 and give them 50 negative consequences within 3 hours. Not helpful. So you try to find some positive incentives as well. Cueing is really important, reminding them, getting them in the habit of external reminders. That's the reason a phone is great with setting reminders, signs of what they're supposed to do. But the internal memory doesn't work well, internal working memory. So external cues are really important, and then reinforcing those is really important.